versus households that are high in chaos or high in the number of socioeconomic stressors. And this is where we see this differentiation in the effect. Very clear pattern where this evidence of this regulatory effect more or less goes away when you look in these chronically stressed contexts and environments. So we interpret this as indicating, perhaps, that whatever it is that these mother-child dyadic systems are doing in terms of co-regulation and each individual in terms of self-regulation, we're not seeing much evidence of it mattering in these chronically. Where we see evidence that it matters is in the more calm, ordered, well-resourced environments. So this would suggest, perhaps, that those chronic stressors are just overwhelming or subsuming those systems, and other things are explaining the covariation that we're seeing between moms and kids. And just to, I guess, to not beat this horse too much, essential, I think, to think about all of this layers and systems. One of the studies we're trying to get funding for now is to do these parent-child and parent-adolescent self-regulation, intergenerational transmission studies in large cross-cultural designs. And it's hard to get funding for that, but we're going to keep trying because we really think we're likely to see really big differences depending on cultural positions on co-parenting, for instance. I mean, big cultural differences in the extent to which the culture says, kids crying, you deal with it. That's what we do. There are a lot of cultures that don't do that. Kids crying, let's help you. The person who's intervening has the same reaction. I want that kid to stop crying. I'm going to help you with this. Or, please deal with this. So it's kind of a silly example, but it kind of isn't. And this is illustrative of the kinds of things that we're really trying to better understand and figure out. So I hope we get to do that work. So just to summarize up to this point, and it looks like I do have a little bit of time, I want to say a bit about current and future work and some ideas for a developmental science initiative here, if you feel like you all are well positioned to do these sorts of things. So what are the constructs? These top-down constructs I've talked about: executive function, emotion regulation, effortful control, physiological regulation. And a general statement, I didn't present data on this, but it's a really important point to me. As we become better acquainted with these different constructs and their relationships with each other, we tend to get into these tussles sometimes about, for instance, right now in developmental psychology work, you're seeing a lot of debates about whether effortful control and executive function are the same thing, or are they different, or is effortful control just emotion regulation, or is it just executive function? Okay, so we've got some basic issues around looking at patterns of at low-level indicators, mid-level indicators, and high-level indicators. And the best evidence for discriminant validity of these constructs is going to be at the highest level. So we have to first get to some kind of consensus about what these hierarchical measurement structures look like. It's no different than what happened in the specific abilities area, what's still happening in the personality and temperament area. It's also true for these self-regulation constructs. So I hope that you know, collectively we can get there, and my colleagues and I will try and keep working on that. When do these develop? Rapid improvements in childhood with deceleration in adolescence. And I haven't shared any of the bad news about what happens in middle age, but it's not all bad news. Read Laura Carstenson's work. And the individual difference is stabilizing by early adolescence. The how appears to have a lot to do with gene-environment interactions involving prenatal and postnatal environments and intergenerational transmission. So where next? Let me say a bit about current and future plans and some ideas for a development science initiative. So at Virginia Tech, we have the Development of Self-Regulation Research Group, which is mostly organized by myself, Martha Ann Bell, and Jungmin Kim Spoon. And collectively, we work on 4 grants. We also have, with some folks in the School of Education and the Math Department, an NSF grant, we're looking at links to cognitive and achievement skills. But basically, we're trying to better understand the vertical integration of the types of effects that we see in terms of individual differences, variances and covariances at these different levels and across these different levels of analysis with regard to this broad self-regulation universal constructs. And of course, looking at development within person, individual differences, not just ontogeny, and between generational differences and similarities. So with regard to intergenerational transmission, I briefly mentioned the work with Jack Bates in Indiana, so we're looking at parenting stress and fatigue. Jen Lansford is the PI on the large cross-cultural study that I'll have to whiz through today, but if there's interest in that, I can say more during Q&A or later today or tomorrow if you want to learn more about it. And with Karen Roberto on this adulthood and aging direction. Looking at gene-environment processes, twin and candidate gene designs, modeling gene-environment interaction effects with Steve Petrill at Ohio State, and with Wenxin Zhang at Shandong Normal University and Beijing Normal University in the GM study, longitudinal study. It's the longest running longitudinal study of kids and teens in China. Looking at neurophysiological processes with regard to temperament and psychopathology as they pertain to self-regulation. Jungmin Kim Spoon is PI right now with Brooks King-Cassis, also at Virginia Tech, looking at self-regulation and health risk behaviors in adolescence. And Martha Ann Bell and I are longtime collaborators looking at temperament cognition, and she's now, in her most recent study, focusing on links to academic success. And finally, with the Learning Transformation Research Group, looking at verbal and mathematical reasoning and its connections to self-regulation. And we're doing some interesting things with, well, maybe they're interesting, math games for iPads, and also doing some secondary analysis in a couple of data sets. So in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of whiz through this bit here, but we're doing a lot of international collaborative work toward getting at questions. How are we doing on a global scale in terms of providing environments and opportunities? Here, we could think today just about for maximizing self-regulation, but this is a general question. And how do individuals develop as distinct people and distinct groups of people? And do these things operate in similar or different ways in different nations and cultures? So collaboration's going. Mark Bornstein at NICHD is leading analysis of the MIX study, a fascinating, massive, every 5-year UNICEF-funded and operated survey. PAC study that Jen Lansford leads, and the in the last couple minutes here, I want to just throw some ideas out at you. And these are, when I was hired at Virginia Tech from the University of Oregon, Virginia Tech had started a developmental science initiative there. And at the same time was launching was soon to launch a neuroscience initiative. And so both took off, and of course, as you know, the neuroscience, a lot of money, it needs to be a lot of money. The equipment's expensive, and you need teams of scientists and on a pretty large scale. And so some of the ideas I'm sharing with you today are old ideas. Some of them are new. The idea, though, is to disseminate ideas and tools. How species groups and individuals develop and evolve to improve the odds of the healthiest outcomes. Your university has in its strategic plan Phase 2, which I don't know if you knew this, but you're in it right now. It's on the web. These interdisciplinary connections very strongly emphasized. These are the kinds of things that I pulled out just from a quick search on the web of the various components here at UMass Amherst, where we might see some connections for an integrated developmental science, linking psychology, of course, with neuroscience. I was going to say, and for applied life sciences. About this is one guy's fairly quick look at a strategic plan document and the various entities on campus that look to me like could in a big way into a robust development science push. Some activities. I think I've offered eight ideas here. So let's see what you think. One idea is to integrate ongoing and launch new statewide longitudinal tracking systems. This is something we've been doing, well, something we've been trying to do at Virginia Tech. In Virginia, the longitudinal tracking systems are intentionally balkanized for data protection purposes. And so we have had to do a lot of work around socialization and working with legal and policy teams to gradually change the attitude, not of the legislators. They're passing all kinds of laws of all kinds. It's the executive branch folks that are deciding what to implement and what to not implement, quietly usually, with regard to creating huge barriers to data set integration. So I think a developmental science push could go a long way in promoting longitudinal tracking, multi-generational longitudinal tracking, as a general infrastructure thing that as a state you would want. And there are ways, we know, right? The computer science folks can help us. There are ways to do this that ensures privacy and protection of all the things that we're concerned about, in spite of the bad news every day of violations of our expectations. But this is super important. If for no other reason than each and every state is pouring massive amounts of money and time into scattered tracking systems with very little emphasis on integration. And if one could pull this off over the course of a career, you could end up with a very substantial resource that internationally would be valuable to people and I would argue would bring in resources from all over the globe in terms of doing basic and applied research. Also, I know some of you are working in Springfield and some have for a long time. And to me, this seems a natural and in my conversations this morning, I'm learning more about the university's interest in really growing a presence and the diversity of the things it's doing. This is a very natural place to grow a major footprint for a developmental science initiative, to establish a developmental science laboratory, but also an outreach operation where eventually a group of folks could provide research and services to government and non-government organizations and agencies that increasingly are having to do that as part of their day-to-day routines just to keep getting the funding they've already been getting in the past. So that's something that this initiative could do a lot for, I think. Certainly leveraging existing data, archiving data sets, and funding and conducting secondary analysis. And I put in a plug for emphasis on longitudinal modeling, quasi-experiments, and meta-analysis, but opinions could vary about the utility of those as opposed to something else. And I already talked about this a little bit, but building core research services in neurogenetics to form partnerships to make especially on the making those resources more available, more reliably available to people so that they could actually be useful. Right now, they're largely inaccessible to people. They're just too expensive, and for the kinds of things we do, without the really high-stake public health outcomes, diseases and disorders, for a lot of the things, we're looking at things that aren't perceived correctly or not as being relevant to that. We have to get in line for access to these resources and really working on increasing access to make this more widely available. I also want to put in a plug for strengthening a differential response to intervention framework. I actually am very concerned about the state of intervention, the approach to intervention that we use. And it's because even in the last stages of an NIH or IES-funded program of development, even then you don't really have to test for differential response. Only with respect to fidelity of implementation and client adherence. I call this sort of, you blame you blame the client, you blame the deliverer. This is hugely problematic because we have many examples we know that environmental change differentiates. Differential response is the norm. And so I think that a developmental science initiative could go a long way if there was a consensus about this. I'm not saying this isn't controversial, to get us to think differently about interventions. We want toolboxes that actually have many tools in them, where we can generate large effects that are replicable with identifiable subgroups, and also always be looking for iatrogenic effects. That is really important, because often a weak average effect is happening because there's a small group that's having a big positive response, and there's a small group that's having a very large iatrogenic negative response. And for me, the mindset should be, let's look for those first. And we'll talk later about whether there's an average effect. Building these toolboxes. So if there was sufficient interest to really go for these intervention and curriculum development projects and efficacy trials, and also measurement development projects, we could do a lot of good in terms of improving for a variety of constructs of broad interest to people in the developmental science area. I mentioned evaluation and dissemination. And finally, scientists and policymaker education and training, really going for training grants, and also developing new certificates, minors, maybe even degrees, if people were interested in going there, to have an impact on the workforce. I'll end there. Thank you for your attention. I want to thank my collaborators and students, and I'm happy to take your questions now.
What kind of interested in species and looking just at mothers, but the other factor is the father.
Yeah.
Given that mothers are now working in the workforce and/or fathers are just more involved in their kids, how much do you think parent father involvement, parent kind of similarity and self-regulation and discipline, and also kind of genetic and temperamental factors of the father and mother plan to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hugely important. So you've got, I picked on the babies a little bit too much today. The kids as perturbers, but the partner is too. And the partner might be, right? Perturbers and ameliorators. So you've got a partner who can pick up the slack. Certainly all these questions around the developmental processes and longitudinal intergenerational story with regard to partnership formation and stability and change, and that all pertains here. I mean, I think you could develop a whole program of research on caregiver self-regulation that wouldn't look hardly at all at the kid. It would focus just on how that system is embedded within the relationship of adults that together collectively are doing the caregiving of the youngsters, and then later, often, of the oldsters. And then caring for each other. So one of the things that Karen patient, we're looking at child, we'd be looking at spouses. And the feedback we got from the program officer was, pick one relationship and stick with it. So that's kind of done, mother-child. And the two is, we get enough dads participating. We get some dads participating, but not enough for us to be able to really analyze their data and say anything conclusive about whether things look kind of similar or kind of different for them compared to, and there's I'm sure a whole literature on gender differences and self-regulation that I'm ignoring in my response. And you mentioned temperament, and I mean, I think all of these things are ways to go into that part of the family system. Usually important. Yeah, it's part of the context here. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Along the same lines, have you looked at the impact of other siblings, also perturbers?
Yeah, indeed. Some would say one of four. The big perturber, in my personal experience. No, not really, but one of the things we've been thinking about, Jungmin Kim Spoon has a long-standing interest in child maltreatment. And we've got a paper under review right now where we're looking at siblings as sources of abuse and victimization experiences. And it's kind of we have, even folks in here would say, a sibling victimizing another sibling is kind of, yeah, you intervene, you want to stop it, but we really do normalize it. And so it's just we're trying to learn more about that, and I think that you could apply this also in that relationship very well in terms of understanding how an older or younger sibling in terms of their self-regulation, is feeding into the trajectory for the target child. Maureen can tell you, I was dyed in the wool of sibling relationships. That's where I got my start in developmental science, and it's a great question. And we're not looking at it, except for statistically, we're using it as a clever quasi-experiment from time to time, but that's a shortcoming, I think, of our work. No dad data, really. No sibling data, really. Yeah.
I was also wondering about just if looking into like early infancy. So we know that in the first 12 months, so much is changing and brain and infants are learning about, starting to learn how to self-regulate as well. And looking at the, parents' response to crying, even as infants, not tantrums of preschool age are very
that's great.
disruptive, but
Yeah.
even for like infant crying in response to that.
No, very important. Dave, I'll point you to David Bridget's work. I'll confess that my interest in the intergenerational transmission borders on obsession, and I'm just really fascinated by it. And the super little ones are troublesome because it takes a few years for that familial signal to show up. So, for instance, when Martha Ann Bell has this wonderful longitudinal study, NICHD funded, where she's got executive function and a couple other self-regulation measures in the moms, and they've got them in these kids from infancy. And Kimberly Cuevas, who's at University of Connecticut, a former postdoc of Martha Ann's, published 2 papers last year showing this developmental emergence of this familial signal. The interesting thing with regard to your question is that it looks like all hell is breaking loose from 0 to 2. It's like the signal ain't there. We see evidence of this in the early heritability work on temperament. It's like, man, there's a lot of noise. And perhaps it's the window, right? I have some basic concerns about the quality, the validity of the measurement for some of these things at those very young ages that I have to resolve for myself. But David Bridget has been doing really important and interesting work, at least with respect to emotion regulation in the caregiver and regulation skills in these infants and toddlers. So I would commend his papers to you. Yeah.
So I guess for a more evolutionary bent on this, if you suspect that there are people in the variation of self-regulation, that there are people across cultures that have poor self-regulation, why do you think that this variation is there? And is there possibly a situation where the variation exists because it could be costly to have increased self-regulation?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm going to give the default response, which is the survival is in the very variance itself. I mean, there can't be any other argument for it. There are going to be many situations where a delayed response, in our case, a reasoned response, will kill you. So it's the whole formula, right? It's not just responding in a well-regulated way. It's responding in a situationally appropriate way. And in evolutionary terms, you've always got to think about, for us, we're fairly limited to focusing on fitness, defined in a particular way there, survival. So that has to be the explanation, right? That the cost. One of the graduate students, his name's Derek Spangler, one of the graduate students in our cardiac physiology group in our department, Bruce Friedman, is the PI of that lab. Derek is very interested in this idea, and he's not looking at cross-cultural questions, but he's just looking at the full range of self-reported and task-based measures of executive function and emotion regulation. And I know about it because I'm on his committee. He's actually working on a paper from our previous mom study showing that you hit a point where you start seeing costs for the superregulators, what he calls the superregulators. He doesn't call them that in the papers, but the vernacular, right? Sure, it's expensive. I mean, there are various ways you could think about this as a metaphor. It's expensive to the system to be able to be doing that, to have that so tuned up. And so you're going to pay a price. So what he's showing is that if you're very good at emotion regulation, you're giving people challenging, frustrating tasks, being a superregulator actually impairs your performance. and it makes sense that it would. Yeah.
So, I mean, that's linear
Yep.
outcomes, but what about
Yeah.
curvilinear and risk, curvilinear and idea of there's risk, and then this system response as opposed to...
Yeah.
And
No, I know. I'm so dumb when it comes to this stuff. I have to confess. I mean, I'm really strict. We have a graduate seminar this semester that I'm leading called Adaptive or Maladaptive. That's the title of the seminar. And we're reading these papers where we're trying to integrate the developmental and evolutionary perspectives on exactly these sorts of questions. How do you interpret, what kind of inferences are you going to make from these curvilinear functions? It might be, and they use the word risk in a very different way there than the way we typically do. A lot of it is simulation and computational type approaches to, there's a break from what you see in the data. You know, they don't match up very well. So it's, I don't know, but it's super important. I mean, we were convinced enough as a group, the faculty, the developmental faculty, and our students. We don't typically do this, but often when collectively we're like, we got to spend some time on that. We set up a seminar, and that's exactly what we did around these sorts of these issues. When do the benefits become? And can we understand that from a developmental perspective, from a family systems perspective? Yeah, great questions. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
You've had an opportunity to tap into many different ways to measure elements of self-regulation.
Yeah.
Attention being one of them. So in some cases you have parent reports across multiple. You highlighted teacher reports. Clearly the work of have you found a way in which these multiple use of self-regulation are we have some definitional issues.
Yeah, I'll tell you. I think we are, but it's an argument. So, I wrote a current directions in psych science paper last year, and maybe it was you. One of the reviewers said, "Oh, here he goes again. He's harping on construct validation and not really giving us the solution," and that's true. So, for instance, when you look at the relationship between any single indicator of emotion regulation, it might be vagal tone, it might be, I don't know, ethical control, maybe, and you look at how it's correlated with a performance-based measure of executive function, that story changes when you create a more reliable emotion regulation. The association goes down. And this is the general pattern that you see, especially when you pull in multiple informants. So we've done a lot of observational work on attention, actually, as well. It's a mess. I mean, it is really a mess. It's very, very complicated, and we have a hard time getting funding for these secondary analysis to do this basic construct validation work. The most avid critics are very much wedded to a particular construct and measure. And I guess my position is kind of contrary to that position, that I'm just not convinced that there's a gold standard measure or method for any one of these constructs. But we'll have to see. I think we'll just have to look and see at the end of my career, at least, whether I did something relatively useful with regard to the construct validation. It's a huge problem. I mean, it introduced so much. We see this in the personality and temperament and psychopathology areas too. A lot of folks just trying to figure out we've got to nail down our constructs and how we're measuring them, and some consensus about how we do that so that we can properly replicate studies. And yeah, thank you.
I know a lot of people have to go on, so we'll stop here. I think he's got a few minutes on his schedule if you want to catch him individually on your way out. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure. Yeah, thanks. Stay warm. Hi.
It wasn't me as a reviewer. The second half of my question, which I get to meet you for dinner today.
Oh, good, good, good.
tomorrow, is
Yeah.
more looking across contexts and across different populations,
Yeah.
how having these different approaches to define and describe what I thought.
I mean, do you have some specific in mind?
Well, I just share some stories of things that we thought were going on, and so I work with Nathan Fox in the
Right.
Bluegrass Project and whatnot, and so we thought certain patterns were going on in the kids who had early neglect, and we thought it was a certain type of attention, and it turns out it's something slightly more focused than that. So when you have populations and you put global terms to them, so ADHD like, autistic like, whatnot, and the factors that I'm looking at tend to be more the regulatory factors. It's interesting to think about, are there elements in which you can understand what's going on with an ERP based on earlier or later temporal processing of something that does or does not map up with what we're seeing in teacher report context. So just more global ways to use these things as helping maybe refine.
Yeah, make
our
stronger
ability to
inferences
look
about
at
what you're looking at. Yeah, cool. All right, very good. Thanks.
I just wanted
pleasure.
to fill in my thoughts because
Yeah.
I have the younger brothers, older brothers and 2 younger sisters, and I always credit my second oldest brother teaching me one of life's lessons. So if he's having a tough day, he was looking for me, and so there were lots of disruption.
Yeah, absolutely. Is it still this way?
Yeah, it is. So I'm pretty close to the oldest brother and the youngest sister, but the 2 are closest to me. Touch base once a year, kind of thing. And it's because it was all that tension.
The shit running down the hill.
Right. Yeah, 'cause I'd have to go and look for my younger sister.
Yeah, wow. Well, thanks for sharing that. I appreciate
So I
it.
just thought in terms of the dynamics, because we had a stay-at-home mom, and my dad, and so she was a lot of her regulation was to keep the dynamics between the siblings. Because,
Oh yeah, I can imagine.
lots, lots of physicality. I really enjoyed that. That was
Thank
great.
you.
Thank
Pleasure. Thanks. Good to meet you. Hi.
Introduce myself. I'm
Yeah.
Amy Ryan.
Hi.
undergrad student in
Yeah, good to meet you.
neuroscience
Good.
here. I did my undergrad at William & Mary though.
Very good. Southerner.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I'm from Jersey, but I
You just.
don't like this stuff.
So you're in denial right now.
Yeah.
Yes, I get it.
Yeah, but so I work with monkeys, and I'm basically going to be trying to look at all this kind of stuff that you talked about.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating because for animal cognition, we've basically started to acknowledge that the individual differences in performance are not noise. And that
Eric and I were talking about that.
Yeah. And so it's what I thought was actually interesting for your intergenerational transmission is even just the idea. So a lot of our monkeys, the way they raise laboratory macaques are that you actually have different rearing conditions. Some of them stay with their mothers.
Right.
Some are removed from their mothers.
Right.
So I'm curious how that would, because we actually have like all of those conditions in our group. So is intergenerational transmission also just removed from the mother, like looking at the genetic components?
Right, of course not. I mean, I think what you'll find is comparable variance in these different conditions. So even if you're finding average effect differences, the story is more about the fact that in this condition, as well as this condition, you're getting all this differentiation. I mean, you could have these wildly different rearing environments, and the variance is retained. The specific gene environment mechanisms